propose, if we understand it, is to insert something that doesn't exist today. And we really believe that the self-certification process works. If there is need for us as an organization to continually help to educate our members about this future guide and program, we would commit to doing that. But I appreciate very much your recognizing me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So just to be clear, then the Coalition for Adequate School Housing is not really supporting recommendation D and having multi-level audits, and you have an alternative way that you think that can be handled better. Is that correct?
That's good. A good summary.
Okay.
Thank you.
When we looked at the recommendations and saw the first part that what Letty's describing here sounds a little less formal than the streamlining recommendation that it points to later on in the document, where you see actually 3 separate steps in interview, audit type, low-C, and then another one midway, and then one at the very end. So for us, we would agree that it seems like more formal delineation of an audit process. It sounds like a multi-part audit than something that may be delineated in an audit guide. So that would be what.
So if I may, Ms. Ferrara as well, so your organization also does not support a multi-level audit as delineated in item D here. Is that correct?
If it's an audit, a hard audit, like a gate rather than a guide, then we would say no. We would not support that.
Are you also concerned about the delay process?
And for those reasons, exactly.
Just as a comment, it would seem to me that if we can identify the exact example that you gave that could be a substantial issue to a district on one component, that actually that to me is a program issue and actually should be handled in the program, and perhaps if there's additional paperwork that needs to be given at that time, and OPSC then, or the office then says, yes, you've met that, it's part of the program review versus an audit review, because I think it would be terrible for a district to make a mistake like that and then have never had corrected it, and 6 years later doesn't have a project.
And that does happen.
So we need to address that at the program side, I think, and we can probably do that.
Thank you.
Good. I think there is a significant misunderstanding in the reading of this item and the intent that the committee had, because we would not want to do anything they've spoken against either. So let me reiterate again what we meant when we discuss incremental audit. There is already an audit interview, but it happens at the end when the project's completely done and they show up on site to do the audit. Our understanding, what we're saying is, if there are audit requirements known, they should have them when they begin to account for the project. So it is not the addition of an audit interview. It is the moving of the audit interview to a time frame that allows the district to comply with the audit and not get a gotcha at the end. Another item is those 05 checks I mentioned. If they, in fact, are going to audit those, and it needs to be reviewed and determined which of those are auditable, but if they are going to audit those things, then move that timeline closer to the point at which that work occurs, leaving really only the playing out of all the expenses and the expenditure audit for the end. We did not suggest any additional items. We, in fact, have talked about less audit items, because there are items they are auditing now that are already audited by others. So I don't think anyone on the committee would have supported an expansion of audit requirements, but rather a better coordination of the audit requirements and the working of a project in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And that may have suffered from a really truncated timeline for writing all this up. So we apologize that we did not catch in our review.
It is really
I don't think
helpful for
Dee
us to
conveyed really what we were trying to do.
Good. Let's move on to the last. We have two more in this, and
Okay.
I think then we should talk about it. Make a
Item E, the LAA should know the requirements for the audit at the time of application and ensure they are keeping the appropriate documentation to qualify expenditures. The School Facility Program Handbook and the Audit Guide should complement each other and incorporate the compliance requirements in the handbook that the LEAs will be audited on and allow the audits to be audited to the Audit Guide requirements. The Audit Guide should reflect and be consistent with the SFP Program Handbook, which complies with statute, regulation, and guidance governing the program. That's what we've been talking
Yeah,
about.
it's pretty clear.
Okay, F, there is a concern that once an audit is closed out, that OPSC has the authority to reopen the audit at any time and relook at the expenditures. The recommendation is audits should not be reopened. Additional audits may be conducted if there's been a legal finding of fraud, misappropriation of funds, or other illegal acts. I wanted to throw my comment in regarding a legal finding of fraud. Actually, I believe this would have been better to say a suspicion of fraud, not necessarily a legal finding.
Not a finding?
Not a finding, because that raises a whole additional level of requirements.
There has been a question
A question of fraud.
So I like your word suspicion. Suspicion of fraud is fine.
Suspicion.
If I may, is that general auditing standards that an audit is final?
Right. Typically, once the auditor issues the final audit report, the audit is final, unless there is an issue that's arisen that would cause another audit to be performed.
Right, and those
We
are
wouldn't
clearly
reopen.
fraud or illegal, some suspicion or some question about whether the audit was conducted at that time appropriate. Something has come up that raises an issue. It just cannot be just reopened as a matter of process, or as done on a random or some method. Once they're closed, they're closed.
Once they're finished.
Are there lots of examples of that's happened?
It's more concern based on wording that we're seeing in the new documentation, that this is, basically subject to re-audit forever. Language
so
that was a concern to districts.
Again, of making sure we're real clear,
And the
rather
other-
than there's been some identified problem that's out there and you're seeking.
The only other
This is
problem-
part of the clarity that we're
Yes.
talking about the district.
And there is a concern right now in that when the audit, because they have a new process now coming to the district, when they're listing all the projects they're going to audit, some of those are past the timeline for being subject to audit, and the district believes those are closed. They're past the timeline.
I've also heard some concern from some districts that their audit they know has been closed, but they're hearing that OPSC is internally reviewing the audits and looking at them, but also not discussing that with the district. And there's concern because the letter has been claimed that, while it's closed out, it could potentially be reopened, and there's no process for a district knowing reopen and why, and there's not a clear process and procedure.
Good afternoon, Lyle Smoot, Los Angeles Unified School District. Listening to this term, suspicion of audits, is a lot of concern.
Yeah.
A legal finding of fraud or whatever, that's a definite thing. There's something there. It is a great concern that the term suspicion of audit or fraud is put into this program, because
that's a
I think it needs to be nailed down pretty clearly. In Los Angeles, we had a number, I don't know the exact number, but a lot of audits reopened not because of anything except the OPSC appeared to want to apply new audit standards to projects that were already closed for a long time. So that's a big issue for the district.
Got it. So you just don't want it to be left that additional, with such language or terminology of a suspicion of, really defined. There should be really clearly defined conditions under which an audit can be reopened.
We would hope so, yes, sir. Thank you.
Well, then, in interest of moving it along, can I offer a recommendation?
Yes.
For our consideration, I would indicate that we as a subcommittee accept the scope and type of audits recommendations A through F and not change the recommendation language in F, with the exception of item D, which will hold in abeyance until we go through the streamlining section, and perhaps we'll revisit that. But I would hold that out and recommend adoption of the remaining. And then that would be my recommendation.
Let's hear this comment from Finance first.
Sure. Chris Ferguson, Department of Finance. We would support the creation of a K through 12 school facilities program audit guide. We believe that it would require some legislative adjustments to put that into the law, and then we would support putting that guide into regulations and annually adjusting that guide similar to the K through 12 education audit guide. As needed. If there are no programmatic changes in a given year, there may be no need to adjust that audit guide in a given year. However, we would also note that the Controller's Office certifies all of the independent auditors under the K through 12 education audit program or audit guide, and we would support the creation then of a similar list using potentially the Office of Public School Construction to certify a list of appropriate independent auditors that would be certified for the school facilities program.
These are things I think we should be discussing, recommendations. They're clear, and I think they would add to the board's coming to grips with this issue of the independent auditor. I think these certainly should be added to our potential for our list to bring before the.
I've been around this process an awfully long time, and nothing is black and white. There's always areas of gray, and as I hear this discussion, I'm taken with the fact that I don't think we're that far apart. I appreciate your comments, recognizing that the board has the policy oversight and the DGS has the administration portion. Our director has said that a robust audit must be independent, it must be comprehensive, and it should be to Yellow Book standards. I think everybody appreciates the fact that you've got to have clarity in what you're going to audit, and there's got to be communication with all parties so they know what to expect in the audit. He has so stated in his letter. Bottom line is we have a $35 billion bond program that the legislature and the governor and the taxpayers expect to have integrity. So you must have independence, you must have thoroughness, and our director, as we speak, is considering options to contract out or to change the nature in which we currently do our audits. So again, we're all, I think, interested in the same thing, and as he said in his letter, any comments, any recommendations, he will seriously consider from any source, and he certainly appreciates the work of not only the working group, but Mr. Lowenthal, Senator Lowenthal, this subcommittee. So on we go.
Let's go. All right. Is there a motion? We'll take that as a...
That's my motion, and so...
I'll call the roll. Senator Lowenthal?
Aye.
Kathleen Moore?
Aye.
Scott Harvey?
Not to preclude the director in his decision-making, I will abstain.
Okay. 2-0.
So the motion passes.
Yes, motion passes.
All
Let's
right.
move on to number 2, procedures on the publishing and finding of the audits.
In accordance with the governor's executive order, audits are posted to the accountability website. The recommendation is that the audit should only be published after the audit report is final and the LEA has provided a written report. Draft review of audit should be given to the LEA 30 days prior to publishing, and the LEA should have 30 days to respond. Responses should be published in their entirety. Audit findings that are on appeal should also be noted with any published audit information.
There's only one recommendation in this category. Anybody want to comment on that? If not, I mean, unless you have some alternative kind of perspective, you don't need to comment on every single one if you're in agreement.
It certainly, if I would say, it certainly sounds reasonable to me.
Sounds
It gives
reasonable.
both
I don't know
parties-
if those numbers and all that,
Yeah,
but
it's
it's worth sending it on to the larger board and, seeing whether these numbers make sense. Again,
This
we're
piece
talking
of
about
it is very
clarity.
new to the districts. I believe there's only one been published to date.
Okay.
So this is a new component for districts, and we just were saying what would be reasonable, we thought.
I think it's worthy of discussion on the board. Okay?
So I'll since there's only one item in this category, unless there's additional public comment, I would move that we recommend on procedures in the publishing and findings of audit issue area A recommendation forward to the full board,
Will
state allocation board.
Executive Officer, please call the roll.
Senator Lowenthal,
Aye.
Kathleen Moore,
Aye.
Scott Harvey.
DGS supports the governor's executive order on accountability, and anything that furthers that we, I'm sure, will endorse and follow, but I will abstain so as not to preclude the director's decision-making.
Measure passes.
Good. Let's move on to the next category, Category 3, process for yearly update and communication to districts regarding changes with the audit process.
Okay, the issue is changes to the audit requirements are not effectively communicated to LEAs. A transparent process to revise the audit guide should be established that is relevant to the time of the audit. The recommendation is to create a standing audit committee that will do an annual review of the audit guide and create a process to address the needed changes. The committee should be comprised of California Department of Education, State Controller's Office, facility and fiscal LEA staff, independent auditors, OPSC staff, and other appropriate staff.
If I may, Chris, is this to which you were saying that you supported, but you think it may take some legislative action as well?
Yes and no. We believe the legislative action would be to specifically authorize the creation of an SFP audit guide, and then we would do that through regulation. It would be similar to the education audit guide that Cassandra...
Are you really saying that we have to have legislation to create an audit guide?
It would be specific to enable that, so that it's very clear as to what would be included in that audit guide and the scope of what that audit guide would cover. I think we're looking at transparency here. If we look at the current K-12 audit guide, there is specifically enabling statutory authority for it.
Well, I think certainly we can look at that, but I would like to hope that we can get to an audit guide without having to have specific legislation authorizing that. I know that there's specific legislation authorizing this, the appeals committee for school districts on their regular audits, and that there's an actually established position, and that's an office all into itself.
Correct. The education audit appeals
But I don't
panel.
think we went that far. I don't think this recommendation goes that far. So
correct. We would encourage that.
Right. I think we should note that. I think that we should, the recommendation should be, I would like the recommendation that we have here, and note also that the recommendation
from the Department of Finance.
From the
Now,
Department of Finance.
I have additional comment on this one.
All right. Good.
That's specific to
Maybe
this.
a statement from the Department of Finance.
Correct. With the Department of Finance, again, that's Chris Ferguson. Specific to this, we would recommend we utilize existing infrastructure. There's a current work group that develops the education audit guide, and we would recommend that we utilize that with the exception that we add district representatives from the facilities program to that work group to create the school facilities program audit guide. And we would also note that we're concerned with the inclusion of independent auditors that would make recommendations on what to be included in the audit guide.
Right, you don't mind the independent auditors, you just don't want them to be, the very reason why we have them may create another conflict of interest.
Correct.
By having them.
Correct. And we think that they should be on the committee in terms of being able to provide input on the documentation that school districts may need, things of that nature, so that they do have a role and play a vital role. But we just don't believe that the independent auditors should be deciding what is and isn't in the audit guide.
Can you write that up? Do we have anything written from them, or just make sure that maybe, Lisa, we can do that to have an addendum to our recommendation?
Chris, can you just make sure I get all your recommendations in writing to add it on?
Sure.
Thank you.
Comments?
Thank you, Senator and members. I'm Mike Ricketts with the County Superintendents Association. I was also on the audit working group, so we'll probably comment on a couple of other things, but specific to what you just heard, I just want to be sensitive to the issue. When we say districts, that includes all LEAs that are subject to audits and that participate in the school facilities program. And that includes counties, because when we talk about representation on working groups, it's really important, especially since we have kind of a unique place in the funding mechanism, that there's county representation as well as school district. So
we will note that in our
So noted, and you also note in the recommendation it does say LEA. So our talking districts, we should be more inclusive and be talking LEAs, and you rightfully correct us. But note that the recommendation does include LEAs, which speaks to your issue. Well, with that being said, I would recommend that under the process for yearly update and communication to districts regarding changes with audit process, that we recommend as a subcommittee to the full state allocation board the recommendation in item A.
Senator Lowenthal?
Aye.
Kathleen Moore?
Aye.
Scott Harvey?
DGS supports transparency and communication, but in deference to not precluding the director's decision-making, I will abstain.
Measure passes 2-0.
Okay, let's move on to streamlining actions within the audit process.
Is it my turn? Yes.
Program requirements can change from time to time, and as a district submits an application. Wait a minute.
Right.
Sorry. Start again.
Start again. Let's wipe that out.
Wipe that out.
Gone.
Thank you. Program requirements can change from the time a district submits an application to the time the project is audited. Recommendation. Draft an incremental review with audit process. Initial consultation with program staff and desk review done immediately after funds are released. Final audit done at the time final expenditure report. Process should be a collaboration between program staff and audit staff.
This is interrelated with 1D, which we just said. I think
Yes.
the same issues that arose with 1D arise here and need to be fully, when we discuss this, we do this as a package on the board, because you can't separate these two, I think. And so even if we do recommend going forward, that issue of multiple reviews needs to be addressed by the board.
Here's what I would suggest, if in concurrence with my panel member or my committee members, if we said after we go through everything, return to these two items, and perhaps what we say is there was a consensus of those. Well, it is a consensus of the committee that for the recommendations. However, this was one area that we think needs further discussion and vetting and fleshing out. So not to preclude the full board from seeing the item and hearing the item, but it may come separately than us under the recommendation.
And also the fact that to clearly what the problems are, what is perceived as, these, while there may be conceptually some issues positive about the multiple, what we're talking about, multiple reviews, there are some questions that raise in doing that and how that could delay processes and how that would be play out, that the board is going to need further discussion.
Right. So I would.
These are very serious.
So just to clearly, so that I understand as we do this, so the things that are that is recommended to go to the full board, we go to the full board, except for these 1D and this issue, which may become under a separate report.
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm saying that let us go through the list. For right now, we'll hold out this one and hold out the other one.
Right.
But then, when the whole item is presented to the board, that these are separate from the consensus, and that we need a fuller discussion on than simply making a recommendation from the subcommittee.
Right.
That's how I saw it.
Which may
From input, right. These are...
include the identification of specific problems and
Right.
kind of conceptually
Right.
what this would look like in further detail.
Do you think,
And if I may comment, this is very hard to write in concept prior to deciding how the audit will be conducted and by whom, because that may matter as to how the streamlining could occur or how any incremental review could occur. So I think the point that the committee really wanted to make was that the reviews be timely to the decisions. That is the overriding concern that the committee had.
Let's hear from...
Okay.
Andrea Sullivan with Orange County Department. Thank you. Andrea Sullivan with Orange County Department of Education. I also participated in the working group. And on these particular items, 1D and the current, I would just recommend possibly sending it back to the working group for some additional discussion to present. I think we didn't have a lot of time from the...
I think it's an excellent suggestion.
Okay.
Those two go back to the working group.
For further fleshing out and maybe consideration of the concerns that have been raised to the subcommittee as well.
That's good.
And then that might affect our timeline for coming back to the State Allocation Board. Mr. Ricketts.
Thank you. And with that, if I could take just a couple more minutes, though, to elaborate on this, and I think what I'm going to say is consistent with what the working group discussed around this issue, is I want to clarify that the working group was really looking at what can we do that would make this process clear, both at the local level with the LEAs that are involved in the projects and at the state level with those that are involved in administering the grants and in overseeing the use of those funds and auditing those funds. And I think you made earlier a distinction that's really important to make again here, and that there's a program function and an audit function. And we really looked at both sides of these, and I think the committee was not so focused on specifying what should be an audit and what should be program consultation and what should be a review. The committee was more focused on saying at the beginning, and this is kind of this three-part process, at the beginning there needs to be clarity with the district as to what the expectations are for the project. And that really comes from the program guide. And so that's where we were looking, and that's more of a program function, not an audit function. At fund release, there's self-certifications, and there may need to be a consultation or review with program staff or possibly with audit staff, especially if there's going to be provisions of that are audited later on. And the point of this is to make sure that as you go through the life cycle of a project, which can span multiple years, and there may be changes in the audit practices that occur during that time, that you have at the appropriate times informed the LEA about what the expectations are, and that if you are doing a review that will affect the final audit of something that happened midway through the project, it happens at that point, and there's a sign-off on that then carries forward to the final audit, so it doesn't become an issue of dispute once the project is completed, especially if it has a fiscal impact on the district. So I just wanted to clarify that kind of the parameters of the discussion and what we were trying to get to with this recommendation.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's two more in that area.
Right, let's move. There's two more under streamlining actions, and I must admit I need to leave in a half an hour, so let's try to get, okay.
We can get there.
Okay, next, let's get there.
Issue B, OPSC staff does not have a good understanding of the entire cash management process within an LEA. The recommendation, provide training to OPSC staff on internal controls, cash management, and multi-fund accounting, not to take an advisory role, but to allow for a better working knowledge of administering the program. One of the concerns expressed in the committee was that from time to time, districts will call OPSC to asked for assistance with how they manage the multi-fund and multi-year aspects of this accounting, because school districts are really mandated to operate annualized single-fund accounting systems. And in fact, they give advice that is contrary to what most CBOs who have been through this and are veterans at it would recommend. And we were further alarmed by a report that OPSC is getting more involved in analyzing and giving advice regarding the general fund or the general ledger aspects. And that was a lot of concern for the committee members, because OPSC understands OPSC's programs. But the district deals with a lot of other issues. And I'm not sure that, or the committee, we expressed an issue with whether or not they understood all our other funding source requirements. The matching funds come from RDAs and from developers and from local bonds, and all of those have individual and separate nexuses. So while we felt that some better education for OPSC staff to appreciate the challenges with accounting for an SFP project, we felt it was not appropriate to have OPSC providing guidance to districts regarding those broader concepts.
So you're not into redefining roles per se, or changing the roles regarding those other funding streams or concepts, but just to increase somehow the communication and let them understand more just what takes place, that there should be not just communication but also maybe some cross-training.
And the way that works out as an issue,
assuming that anybody is taking over anybody else's roles. Right. Yeah. I don't know how that plays out, whether what those issues are, but I get the concept. I'm not quite sure I understand how we do it, but I think that it's consistent, the idea of some cross-training. The issue is making sure we're not telling people your job now is to do something that it's not to do.
And this works itself out, for instance, in inventory rules versus capitalization rules. The districts are doing a very complex exercise in meeting all the requirements of the state accounting manual and meeting the requirements of the school facility program audit. And sometimes they are really difficult to reconcile. So better education would help the program requirements be more efficiently accounted for. But the last thing I think most districts think they need is somebody else telling them another way they have to do things and comply with. So that's the delicacy.
All right, we will struggle. Let's move on to the next.
C, audit requirements related to financial accounting are not coordinated with the requirements of the California School Accounting Manual that affects all LEAs. The recommendation is that OPSC staff to coordinate with the California Department of Education staff that maintain the CSAM to assure financial documentation for audits is an integrated part of the CSAM and does not impose additional accounting burdens on LEAs.
Again, seems reasonable to
not
be
being an auditor
coordinating.
Myself, it seems, but I have no idea what we just said.
Seems reasonable.
But it seems reasonable when you're in the dark.
An easy way to explain this is something that we've talked about in the program working group, is having one tracking number for building a school. It's let's make sure we have one documentation guideline that applies across the board, and there's not two different standards.
While we're on this section, under B, we would be, Department of Finance would be very interested in receiving or working with districts to understand their cash management and their accounting practices. So if you could include us as well, we'd be very interested in that.
Okay. Is there a motion?
I would move in the streamlining actions within audit process. I'll hold off on A and would move B and C go forward to the full board.
Senator Lowenthal?
Aye.
Kathleen Moore?
Aye.
Scott Harvey?
BGS supports the training of OPSC staff. We will have our staff to Yellow Book standards when appropriate. We do not endorse duplicative and redundant audits, and we want timely decisions. Having said all of those things, I will abstain for the reasons stated earlier.
And then just to seek clarification, is the direction of the subcommittee to take item 1D and what is this, 4A back to the working group for further clarification? Or is it, do we take all of these, is it potentially take all of these to the state allocation board and let the full board flesh it out?
Well, or do both, to send it back, just let them know to bring it back to the state allocation board, but with the idea that we have also sent these two items back so that they know for the working group to come back with more fleshed out. I really like using the working group.
Okay. So just to make sure I'm clear,
I'm just concerned about the time frame.
Ask my other working group, ask the working group if when and if we can meet again, the possibility to flesh out this, and then whatever the recommendations come back, included in the report that's going to the full board, or would you want me to try and come back to subcommittee or coordinate with the chair?
All of those seem very interesting, Lisa. But
do you want to maybe establish the timeline, and then that would help?
Yeah, let's just talk about the timeline.
How about if we recommend that these recommendations go before the state allocation board November 3rd? Is that? I know you're not here at the October 6th meeting. Is that correct?
Right.
So would you like
November
to do that?
3rd.
So November 3rd. So you can back into the date from there, whatever OPSC requirements are for producing documents to go to the next board meeting. We'd have to meet those deadlines.
So I'll take that as a recommendation by the subcommittee to talk to the chair of the SAB to make sure that this is included in the project workload and included for the November meeting.
Right, if we can. Then get back to it if there's going to be an issue.
Is that okay, Mr. Harvey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Audit appeals process.
Currently, LEAs can appeal issues through the SAB. A process is needed to address audit discrepancies that have a fiscal impact on the district and the state. Recommendation: create an appeals panel as an SAB subcommittee to hear fiscally related appeals. Subcommittee to consist of representatives from the CDE, Department of Finance, and Legislature. Subcommittee to determine appropriate process and timeline. Consider establishing a more formal appeals structure modeled after the Education Audit Appeals Panel formal process, if in the future the subcommittee approach is insufficient. The thought being that there is already a process there that seems to work well, and that if the subcommittee doesn't seem to be an adequate process, perhaps model after the one that we use for other educational appeals.
Yes, so do I. I'm not sure how this works, but Mr. Harvey.
I just have a question about the level of discussion or kinds of things the working group may have discussed relative to conflict. I use that because earlier you had talked about why there should be an independent audit separate from OPSC because OPSC had their hands in the process. Obviously, the SAB has its hands in the process.
Right.
And I'm trying to get a better understanding of where you see conflict in one area and not in the other, and if you were forgiving at the board level, why, and why not in the case of OPSC?
This would possibly be me speaking and not the committee, but I think there is a level of detachment at the board from the everyday processes. But we did talk about would the subcommittee in fact be an entity of the process, making the alternative process more appropriate. We did talk about that. Do you have any additional recollection?
As Letty stated, we did talk about actually creating a panel or some other entity to actually hear the appeals because of the possibility of some conflict. But, given the timeline, this is what we came up with to give to the committee to discuss.
Just to flesh it out a little bit more, as a for example, if there was a recognized appeal or appeal had been submitted to the Office of Public School Construction, there would be, OPSC would come up with a determination, and based on that determination, it would go to the subcommittee if such this was created to hear this, for the district to present their side, for OPSC to present their side. If an agreement was reached, it would go to the full board. If there was an agreement, then it would be sent out to an ALJ for official determination or review, so that there was an outside legal entity, somebody other than the board, in the disagreement, because as recognized in the director's letter and the AG's opinion, the final determinant on appeals is the state allocation board. So that was the thought of it. And if, by chance, if that OPSC remains control or some control of audits, but there was also the variation if the controller or some other entity has it, how would that process be modified? But there needs to be kind of an official appeals process outlined.
We would support having the Education Audit Appeals Panel be the entity responsible for handling any audit appeals. We believe that enabling statutory legislation or enabling legislation would be required to authorize the Audit Appeals Panel to handle this, but we believe that entity is in place now and would be capable of reviewing these audits. It's also a process that school districts are familiar with currently.
Mr. Chairman, members, Tom Duffy again for Cash. In reading this, and I appreciate Ms. Kaplan's comment because it inserted something that may help to understand, but in reading what is written, first, it appears that the subcommittee would actually be an appellate body on fiscally related appeal. Then when you read the rest of what's in the box, it identifies that it would create a process. It seems to me that the idea of having a subcommittee vet appropriate information that would basically distill what would go to the board makes sense, and it may make it more efficient for the appeals process for the board. That's different, however, from what I'd understood Ms. Kaplan to explain when she talked about an agreement at the appellate subcommittee level, and if that goes forward, it would go to the board with the board recommendation for approval, if I'm understanding this correctly. But if not, that it would go to an ALJ, some outside body. I think that there appear to be at least three concepts, then, both in what's written and what's discussed. And I would say, if you're going to have a review again by the working group, this may be one that you would want to have more discussion.
I definitely agree.
Thank you.
And as you discuss it, I do like the concept of that Chris Ferguson talked about of an existing body as opposed to creating a new body, particularly this time in government. I think we should look at our efficiencies, and well, we always should be looking at efficiencies, but particularly now. So I would ask the committee to consider that component of it as well.
And that was actually included as part of our discussion. It was like we didn't want to recommend one or the other because it may change depending on if, for whatever reason, the controller's office comes under and takes over the audits, then the appeal process would then apply.
The only other piece that I would suggest about this, however, is if indeed, as Mr. Ferguson indicates, that we have to have law to implement this, you know, we all know the legislative process. That's a good year before that would happen. So I would be interested that if there is a recommendation, an interim recommendation of the committee as well, because we have a year between now and the time really a piece of legislation could be vetted and if it was successful, pass. And yet we have an ongoing problem, I think, in the area. So I'd like to see recommendation I'd like to see the committees consider that.
It's an excellent suggestion. And we'll include all that as part of our recommendation.
So we don't make any recommendation on 5 other than it goes back with the other 2.
Right.
And we have one more, right?
Do we need let's have a vote. Do we need to vote on that?
Why don't we just make it official that the recommendation is to go back to the working group? Senator Lowenthal?
Aye.
Kathleen Moore?
Aye.
Scott Harvey?
I can endorse that one, but I do want to make a statement as well, which is the DGS director has recognized that there needs to be a formal appeals process. He is working on one, and it will be published. But for the reasons so stated, I can endorse this going back to the working group with an aye.
Okay.
May I just ask, Mr. Harvey, is that an appeals process solely for audits or an appeals process overall?
It's overall.
Thank you.
Let's move on. I have to be 15 minutes. Let's go.
We're going to get you out of here.
Reorder the index of the OPSC audit guide.
The issue is the audit guide summarizes the audit requirements for each local educational agency. The recommendation is the audit guide index should be reorganized to coordinate with a revised SFP handbook to allow a better definition of the subject areas. A sample portion of the example proposed index is attached. So what the working group did is went through the existing audit guide and on the page labeled contents, you can see all the changes, recommended changes.
Yeah, but you're going to have the same issue here with the audit guide, that some of these issues, various stages of audits, we've referred that back to the subcommittee, so this too has to be referred back since we're trying to integrate everything.
Correct.
This part would be referred
It could
back.
potentially
to the
change,
audit.
yes.
This could change.
But by way of example, I think the significant redesign is that the things that apply to all SFP programs are handled in one section, and then the manual would go program by program. So joint use, high performance, financial hardship.
Right.
So that each program's components are not scattered throughout the document, but there's one place they can go to and feel assured they have an understanding of what will be required of that program.
Which might mean that it's repetitive, correct? So
Yes.
because there are some requirements that flow through all programs.
Well,
and some
if it's
that
all,
don't.
Section 2 is the things that apply to everyone. So no matter what you were doing, you would
Those are
you
general
would look
audit-
at Section
audit
2
requirements for everyone.
plus anything that from Section 3 that applied to your funding.
Okay.
Okay, that makes
That
sense.
was the idea. Not the specifics, but the concept.
I'm very supportive of the concept that an audit guide and the program guide should align and be user-friendly to the school districts, because ultimately the objective is for the districts to know the rules and therefore be able to proceed with their projects under the rules and at the end have a clean audit. That's all of our objective, I believe. So any way that we can help that type of information flow is going to be very successful, I think, with having clean audits ultimately at the end of the project.
Okay.
So do you think this is something that goes along with the streamlining?
Why don't we just send this back to the working group for, in case that any changes come up as a result of the recommendations in the review?
Right.
Okay.
Fine.
So then I'll make that motion. And
Senator Lowenthal?
Aye.
Kathleen Moore?
aye.
Scott Harvey?
Aye.
If I may make a motion?
Yes.
I just wanted to say, if indeed we are moving forward for November 3rd, I think that there should be a subcommittee hearing prior to November 3rd and not leave this out loose, so that everyone has an opportunity, again, to also make their comments in public and then a recommendation to the State Allocation Board. So whatever that timeline is.
Yeah, we can work around that.
Back into it.
The other thing is, I just wanted to ask the Letty and maybe Cassandra, did you ever talk about any recommendation about audits, about a time frame when audits must be completed by upon project completion? Or do we need to address the time frame? I mean, what I had heard at some point, and I think that you've done a great job, and I'm not saying this, we need to deal with it, but the one thing I had heard out there was I could have, and you mentioned it also, people, programs or school districts that completed their projects and the audit didn't occur until significantly later. Is that something that needs to be addressed, that issue? And I'm not saying I know exactly how you would address it.
We did talk a lot about that. It's not in the recommendations because I think what we really came to was that the law in place now should be followed. The regulation, sorry. Regulation. So there is a very defined regulation now that sets a time frame within which an audit should begin, and once begun, it should be completed within 6 months, I believe it is.
Okay.
But currently, there is a very broad interpretation of that, and I think districts will be inclined to support a more literal translation of that.
So,
well, let me hear from Mr. Duffy first.
Thank you, Senator Tom Duffy again for Cash. We in the letter that we submitted to you, we suggested the 6-month time frame on what we discussed earlier on information being before a district or before a state agent that's looked at 3 or 4 years later means that people may have changed jobs, information may be lost. So if there is a time frame of an audit that is related to the notice of completion being filed on the project, therefore the project is closed, occupied, then if it's in a 6-month time frame, we think that that's healthier and better information is more available both to the state and to the district. So we're in support of that. And I appreciate you bringing that up, Senator.
Thank you. I would like to see where the subcommittee the audit working group wants to deal with that issue and come back to.
And it could be is we'll look at the regulations, and if the regulations need to be maybe clarified, we'll look at that.
Good.
One of the thoughts is that perhaps parts of the audit can be carved up to be covered in the annual audit that's performed by the independent auditors. So, for example, the expenditure part can be done during the course of the annual audit. And so that's something to be considered. So you have different, you may not just have one audit. In other words, you may have several components or several different audits, but you address the expenditure portion in the annual audit, so it's done routinely. So if there's an issue with how they expend their funds, it's brought up and it's discussed and it's dealt with, so then you don't have those same mistakes the next year. And then there'll be other components that, like in the approval process, for example, looking at the architect and whether it was competitively bid, that's done. It's a very short, condensed review. It's very focused. So there are different ways you can approach it, so it's not like an all-encompassing audit. And so I think that's one of the things that the working group was discussing.
Good. Would you like to make a final comment?
No. I'm good. Great.
Scott?
Fabulous work.
I think this is just great work. I look forward to the working group dealing with some of these issues. It's been a great process. Coming back to the subcommittee, and we'll have that meeting. We'll set that up before the full November 3rd meeting. Good work. Thank you all.
Thank you.
This subcommittee is adjourned.